you, Chairman, and all the distinguished members of the Ohio's 133rd General Assembly. I'm from New York, so I talk very fast, so it will accommodate your agenda.
Drug experts are sounding the K2 alarm as well.
They're putting rat poison in this particular compound, and the rat poison is causing people to bleed from their eyes and their ears. So it's really an overwhelming problem that we have to get a handle on.
Mr. Maltz.
Chairman Royce and distinguished members of the committee, I'd like to thank you for this opportunity to discuss these important topics for our national security. Chairman Royce, after hearing the news this week, I want to echo Juan's comment. I wanted to congratulate you and your family for an outstanding career in public service and all you've done for our nation. And I know firsthand, as Juan already alluded to, that you were very much the leader behind helping us get Victor Boot and put him in jail.
Thanks, Derek.
I was the agent in charge at the Special Operations Division for, almost 10 years, and I'm in daily contact with all my friends in law enforcement around the globe. I'm very focused in on the threats to this country and how they impact our national security. As you remember, I lost my brother Michael in the U.S. Air Force Pararescue Unit in Afghanistan, so I'm extremely passionate about public safety and national security and accountability.
Derek Maltz, a former head of the Special Operations Division at the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration, the DEA. Gentlemen, thank you both for joining me in the arena. Derek Maltz, the war on drugs has been a massive $1 trillion failure, has it not? For more than 4 decades, all it's given us is more war and more drugs and helped the U.S. produce, I think, the world's biggest prison population.
Well, first of all, I never called it a war, number one. Number two is that if you lost a loved one to this epidemic, then you would be very happy that the DEA and other law enforcement agencies are out there trying to enforce the law. Unfortunately, this particular problem requires much more than law enforcement. And quite frankly, it's been neglected for many years, and hopefully we can get it back on track.
Hello everybody, welcome to the Patriot Show. I'm your host, Anthony Stephen Malone. Today we have a very special guest on the show again, Derek Maltz, former Director, US Department of Justice, Special Operations Division. Today we are speaking about something that'll be very interesting for a lot of my friends in the law enforcement and in the intelligence community across the world. We're going to be speaking about Project Cassandra. Hello, Derek. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine, Anthony. Thanks for having me back.
No problems at all, Derek. Thank you for coming on the show, and thank you for coming on and speaking about Project Cassandra, because what happened with Project Cassandra and what is going on in the world now is very relevant. A lot of my viewers would have seen part 1 of this interview, but some of them might not. Can you give me a very brief overview about your background, please?
So, Anthony, I spent like 28 years in the Drug Enforcement Administration. At the end of my career, I was running the New York Drug Task Force in Manhattan with the state and local police and the DEA, working on global investigations. And then my last 10 years, I was able to run the Special Operations Division in Virginia, which consisted of 30 agencies to include the UK, Australia, the Canadians, and also the NYPD, along with the US law enforcement, DOD, intelligence community agencies. And we primarily were focusing on synchronizing, the cases against global threats around the world that impact all of our countries. So that's what I did. It was a great job, and I hated to leave.
Yeah, you were excellent at your job, and the men under your command during that time period speak very highly of you as well. Project Cassandra, there's been a lot of talk about it. There's been a lot of people have written about it as well, but you were on the inside of all of this. Can you give my viewers a little bit about the background of how Project Cassandra actually came to exist in the first place?
So, Anthony, I'll try to make it brief, but over the years, the DEA, working with the South American offices of DEA, in Colombia specifically at that time, or in South America in the tri-border region down in our southern cone, we started seeing lots of Lebanese organized criminals getting involved with the Colombian cartels at first. And this was going on for many years. I had no idea what was really going on. When I took over the Special Operations Division in 2005 after 9/11, obviously we were paying attention, much more attention to the crime and terror convergence with organizations around the world. So in South America, we started seeing, huge amounts of cocaine and money being, handled by these Lebanese guys, and didn't really understand it. So we started digging into it. So DEA, we had several operations, starting with Operation Titan, which was one of our sophisticated money laundering pickup operations. And we started, getting involved in an undercover role with many of these money brokers in Colombia. Fast forward, as a result of doing that, we shared a lot of information with the Colombian National Police, who initiated judicial investigations against this major Medellin-based, Oficina de Investigados, which has been around for a long time. Francisco Flores and others, major guys working, moving money and drugs around the world. So anyway, in Operation Titan, there was a major takedown that took place in Colombia around 2007. And we started realizing the significant connections between the Colombian cartels and Hezbollah members who were trying to generate funding streams, post 2006 war with Israel. Yeah. And so we started really becoming very interested. But where it really hit home to me is in 2007, I visited the United States Military Command, Southern Command in Florida, met with a very decorated, very influential Admiral James Stavridis, who also later became the Supreme Allied Commander. Admiral Stavridis and I, we talked for about an hour, and I briefed him on what we were doing in DEA. He briefed us on a little bit of what was going on in Southcom, but he provided me a slide. It was a fireball slide when, the nexus between Islamic terrorists and narco terrorists come together. It was his worst nightmare. So that kind of resonated in my brain. But then our Secretary of Homeland Security, Michael Chertoff, was putting out news messages how Hezbollah made Al-Qaeda look like the minor leagues, okay? So as the head of the Special Operations Division around that time frame, I started getting a little bit concerned. I didn't know much about Hezbollah. Of course, I know about the 1983 bombing of our, barracks in Beirut, where we lost hundreds of folks. But again, as the head of DEA Special Operations Division, I didn't know much about this threat. I didn't realize how much involved they were in the Western Hemisphere. So we in DEA, we started a global initiative, which we later called Project Cassandra, which was a consolidation or an inventory of all the investigations around the world that had a similar nexus. And so that's kind of the genesis of what happened. So we started to put together a task force group in my Special Operations Division to kind of look at this stuff closely, the worldwide money flow and stuff like that.
Yeah, the connections. A lot of people have heard some of the key words there: Hezbollah, Al-Qaeda, international terrorism. They're words. What people don't understand is all this now, today, right now, is interconnected. Hezbollah are a global criminal organization and a terrorist organization as well. Can you speak a little bit about that, please?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Post 9/11, the DEA administrator and the DEA chief of operations made a concerted effort to help in any way we could in the DEA at the global connections between the crime and the terrorists. Specifically, it started out in Afghanistan because of the Taliban kingpins that were involved in all the opium and, heroin trade. And the monies were being used to go after our, united forces, right? So we started putting a lot of, influence or a lot of resources into this area. But at the SOD operation, post 9/11, they formed a small unit called the Special Coordination Unit. But when I got there in 2005, we started seeing overwhelming connections between the terrorists and the criminals. So we formalized a unit called the Counter Narco Terrorism Operations Center, also known as the SINTOC, which focused exclusively on these narco terrorism organizations, working with all the other government agencies that had a role in terrorism. Now, one thing I want to make clear is like we weren't trying to take over the terrorist investigations, but we were getting overwhelmed by the amount of terrorist groups that were tapping into crime for funding streams, right? And we, meaning me, I mean, we always knew the Colombians like the AUC and the FARC, they were doing that in Colombia and emerged as some of the biggest narco terrorist groups in the world. But we didn't realize Hezbollah and Al-Qaeda and Hamas and all these other groups were using the proceeds of crime, not just drug trafficking, but human smuggling, arms trafficking, counterfeiting, sex trafficking, using those proceeds of crime to supplement their revenue so they could actually go after, they could carry out their radical agenda. So it became overwhelming, but we started to really focus in on that.
We're going on about the proceeds of crime. I don't want an exact amount because that'll be nearly impossible. What kind of sums of money in America and globally are we talking about here?
So, Anthony, all I can tell you is I'm not a big guy on statistics because it's an old saying, you don't know what you don't know, right?
Yeah.
But here's the thing. The UN was estimating back in those days that drug trafficking alone was generating like 320 billion annually around the world. But counterfeiting was right up there and arms trafficking was getting close. But what I was told a couple of years ago is that even counterfeiting surpassed drug trafficking. So we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars, I mean, that were being generated from crime, right? And God only knows the real numbers, but the terrorist groups started realizing they no longer had the traditional state sponsorship. They didn't have their charitable fundraising schemes operational like they once had, because the DOD of the US and other military units and other intel communities around the world started cracking down on these terrorist funding streams. So they realized that the crime was easy, right? Just provide some security for multi-ton shipments of cocaine coming into West Africa and get paid millions of dollars and never go to jail, never get caught. So they started taking advantage of the weaknesses and the amount of money being generated.
Yeah, in quite a lot. It's not one element of this. There's a lot of different elements that have been drawn together on this. The human smuggling. I'll give my viewers just a little bit of an example here. Just in the UK alone, don't forget we're a very small island. The people smuggling and human trafficking for the past year was estimated to be between 1.4 billion and 1.7 billion pounds. That's just the UK. That money being sent back to help organize crime and to fund international terrorist operations. There's one thing to think about that. That's just England. That's not Europe or America. Just so we're talking about massives of sums of money here from organized crime being used to funnel back to help fund international terrorism.
Exactly. What we realized in Cassandra really early on is that after the war in Israel, with Israel, they needed cash, right? They were under sanctions in Iran. They didn't have the cash flow. They weren't providing Hezbollah the resources. So that's why they started this used car operation in the west coast of Africa, in Benin. And we were looking at like aerial photos of these car parks before and after the war. And it was mind-boggling because before the war, the oceanfront property was just vacant. There was nothing there. But after the war, when we looked at aerial photos, we saw thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of vehicles lined up in the car parks in Benin, because this was the scheme that they developed with Hezbollah and the drug traffickers to generate all kinds of money. And we could go through that as we go through the story.
Yeah, yeah. It's not something small, which is why I think that this interview is very important. There's a lot of elements to this, and it's quite a complicated situation with all the elements involved. So these terrorist organizations haven't just done this off the cuff. This has taken a lot of planning and a lot of organizing over a lot of years as well. This has been going on there. When did you first, in your opinion, when did you first, after the Israeli war with Lebanon, when you saw a peak in activity in West Africa, did you see that peak across the board with Hezbollah?
Well, we were specifically focused on the car parks in Benin, West Africa, but of course this was going on in many other places, right? We were overwhelmed by the information. I mean, from the drug case in Colombia, there were over 100 people arrested. It was the North Valle cartel, the remnants of Medellin cartel, Guatemala, Venezuela, Panama, the Middle East. We had shipments of cocaine leaving the tri-border region. All this crime was going. They were sending loads into Jordan. They were sending loads into, all over the Middle East. But what we saw was we arrested a subject named Chekri Harb, and we started getting a lot of intel. They called him the Taliban, I believe. He was down there coordinating everything at the highest levels of the cartels. But then when we started looking at the specific Hezbollah operatives, we identified a guy, Ahmad Juma. Okay, he was conducting all the operations in Africa, working with other guys like Robert Elias and other members of the organization. But we did learn about a guy named Abdullah Safi Abin, who opened up the doors in the Lebanese Canadian bank for the money laundering program. That really was the gist of what we were doing at that time, right? So what we saw multi-ton quantities of cocaine leaving South America, going into West Africa. The drugs were then being distributed in Europe, Australia, all over the world. And then the monies were collected. And we're talking about millions of dollars in cash, euros and US dollars. Then they had couriers, Middle Eastern couriers, carrying in suitcases across the border of Benin and I think it was Togo. And they were getting on Middle Eastern flights right into Beirut Airport in Lebanon. And we had informants that were telling us the story. So when the monies arrived in Lebanon, they had Hezbollah militants controlling the security of the money into the money exchange houses. Then once the money got into the exchange houses, they were routing the money to Lebanese banks. One bank that was identified right off the bat was Lebanese Canadian Bank. And then from there, we followed the money flow back into the US and back to the corresponding bank accounts for all these used car businesses. So what they were doing was we identified about 300 businesses in America. They were getting the cash from Lebanon. They were using the cash then to buy used cars in America at auto auctions and other ways, wholesale vehicles. Yeah. Then they were using Hezbollah shipping companies to ship the vehicles back to West Africa to sell the vehicles at a 25% profit. So we identified this multi-billion-dollar trade-based money laundering scheme that was all designed to get cash going back to Hezbollah. And Ahmad Juma was the main guy in our U.S. investigation. He was indicted in the Eastern District of Virginia, federal indictment, moving the proceeds of about 85,000 kilograms of cocaine for the Los Zetas cartel. He also, it was estimated at that time, he was moving about 200 million a month, or 2.4 billion a year, right, through the scheme, right? So think about it, right? That was one guy moving these cars and setting up this global thing. We had an undercover agent, a DEA agent in Guatemala, picked up $20 million in cash from 2 Guatemalan couriers on behalf of this organization because they thought he was a big money launderer. They had so much cash, hundreds of millions of dollars they needed to move. So just to give you an idea of the scope, right? So when we had this identified, we had to do something about it. So Project Cassandra really was an effort by multiple agencies at the SOD task force to start utilizing the laws of America, teaming up with the U.S. Treasury Department, U.S. State Department, and our Southern District of New York prosecutors. So we came up with like a four-pronged attack against this network. So we did what we called an unprecedented USA Patriot Act 311 action. So what that meant, Anthony, is we were able to utilize our U.S. Treasury. We made an announcement to the world that it was suspected that the Lebanese Canadian Bank were facilitating, major money laundering for bad guys, which pretty much puts the world banks on notice to stop working with the LCB, right? And so what happened after that action, we did indictments. We did the indictment on Juma. We did other actions, like we did a $480 million civil suit against 30 businesses in America and the Lebanese Canadian Bank. We also, at the same time, we did a lot of Treasury actions like sanctions against businesses and people around the world. So we did a full court announcement to the world, this is huge. And we have to pay attention to this the convergence of crime and terror. And so it was a pretty powerful thing, but as we tell the story, there was a lot of disappointment as well. One thing that was really cool, Anthony, that I'm really proud of, and I had no idea that these laws were on the books, okay? So because we had some really smart government contractors that had previous engagements with North Korea and other countries around the world, we were able to utilize this same blueprint against the Hezbollah that we did with other networks in other cases, right? But this was the only time ever with a drug case. But here's what happened. After we did this announcement, Lebanese Canadian Bank understood that U.S. was all over it, so they moved their cash all around Lebanon to different banks. Yeah. We were able to identify $150 million sitting in Lebanon Banco Francais in Lebanon. It was held in an escrow account. So in August of 2012, the United States Attorney in the Southern District of New York, we did a aggressive action to seize that money. So the bank's lawyers contacted the United States and said, look, we don't know what this is about, but we'd like to, because what we did was we froze any movement of money from the corresponding banks in America that were dealing with this bank sitting on the money. But what happened was, the next day, they wire transferred $150 million from Lebanon right to the United States Marshal's account in New York. That's how serious this was. So ultimately, the U.S. government forfeited $102 million of the bad guys' money in our country. They settled on 102 because there was some legitimate funds commingled in there and stuff like that. Bottom line is, it became a very, very awesome action against Hezbollah to disrupt their global trade-based money laundering. But it was just a drop in the bucket because they were so massive. We had no idea. So the DEA, after this stuff, we didn't sit there and raise the white flag that Hezbollah was surrendering. We continued pursuing more and more actions around the world against Hezbollah, but it became very overwhelming.
Yeah, with this, obviously, I've lived in Beirut. I was involved with the investigation into Anan Abu Ayesh and the Bank of Medina. So all this is interconnected as well. Exactly. It is huge. The amount of money being laundered through the Lebanese banking system is phenomenal. People, unless they know a little bit about it or been on the inside of this, part of an investigation, people will never understand the amounts of money involved in this.
And corruption too, Anthony.
Yeah, well, yeah, getting on to the corruption, there's some good people in the Lebanese government, but there's also some people, in my opinion, shouldn't be there.
Right, and when I say corruption, I wasn't necessarily referring to Lebanon. As an example, in this whole scheme, the command and control elements were operating in Venezuela. And at that time, President Chavez's government, so corrupt that the director of intelligence, General Carvajal, was the one who was orchestrating all these shipments with impunity because nobody was able to infiltrate the Venezuelan corruption. And we had another subject that we subsequently indicted, Walid Makhled, who was working with Carvajal and the FARC in Colombia, getting all the loads into Venezuela. So they had a seamless operation from Colombia and the production distribution networks into Venezuela, and then shotgunning around the world these multi-ton shipments of cocaine. But we indicted those subjects, but unfortunately, because of the politics and other stuff we could talk about, we never were able to get them in America.
Yeah, it's frustrating from a law enforcement point of view. You're able to get them, or you know everything, but you're not, because of politics, get involved again on it. A lot of people would have been quite surprised by some of the things we've just spoken about there. The pipeline is not a one-way system either, from the Middle East to Central Americas or into Europe. It's a double one. It comes back. So opioid goes one way, used cars and cocaine come back the other way. So pretty much the rat lines, or the politically correct term now is the pipelines. If people focused on them, on the finance, the money, and closing the pipelines down, in your opinion, would that stop a lot of terrorist organizations?
Well, look, if you shut down the money, that's a big problem for any transnational criminal network or terrorist group. And that's where we could do a lot better. I mean, in this particular Project Cassandra, we had some really good experts that helped us follow the money.
Yeah.
But in reality, in law enforcement around the globe, there's a shortage of expertise when it comes to understanding global money movements. And now with cryptocurrency and other encrypted apps that they're using, it's becoming even more sophisticated. But you know, with the trade-based money laundering schemes and the black market peso schemes that are out there, it's really, really complex stuff. And I'll be honest, I mean, I was never an expert. I'm still not an expert on global money laundering, but I learned a lot watching these bad guys operate. Fortunately for me, I had some really smart people helping us put together the pieces of the puzzle. But it's overwhelming for any country to deal with this. But in a perfect world, if you shut down the money, you shut down the bad actors.
Yeah, which is what I think. I know agencies doing some incredible work on this, so we wish them the best of luck on this one. Project Cassandra, it was a success. It worked well. Interagencies, it done some good work. Can you tell us a little bit about the build-up of the good work and the successes achieved and the lessons that were learned before it was closed down?
Okay, so first of all, let me just say this. Project Cassandra is still actually going on. There's a lot of rhetoric. They talked about how it was shut down. So there's a little bit of a misconception, which I can explain. Bottom line is it was a tremendous success for multiple agencies working together, right? But it also was a monumental failure, which exposed the weaknesses in all of our systems, how we operate in silos, especially when we look at terrorists, right? Traditionally, like, terrorists had a certain ideology and they really weren't involved in serious crime, right? But things have changed in the world, and now it's all about the money. So the terrorist groups need money to operate. They're realizing that crime is a great source of revenue, so they're embracing each other, right? And so you have to have convergence of the good guys because we have convergence of the bad guys, right? But unfortunately, we have antiquated laws, we have antiquated policies. So the guys and ladies out there that are working on the terrorists, they're operating in these bubbles, right? And then you have the criminal guys and ladies working on the crime, and there's no coming together. So in our task force, that's what we tried to do. But even in our task force, which was set up for this exact reason after 9/11 by the FBI director, the DEA administrator, and the the Attorney General of the United States, we still had monumental failure with information sharing. Okay, that's why I wrote a document, and I called it the lessons learned document, just to put stuff out there, not to criticize anybody, because everybody's working really hard, but to learn from the mistakes that we made to make it better next time. In my view, the U.S. government lost an extraordinary opportunity to prosecute and shut down Hezbollah, which was operating like a global drug cartel, and still are, okay? And so we lost the opportunity because no one wanted to accept the fact that they were involved with such large-scale drug trafficking and money laundering. They were in denial. And it comes down to egos and, guys working on Hezbollah for 30 years that are the quote-unquote experts. They didn't see it. They didn't report it. So therefore, it can't be true. Meanwhile, DEA's got operatives inside these organizations that are telling us everything going on, and then we're corroborating it by large seizures of drugs and money. So we just didn't do a good job of integrating our capabilities. And as we say in America, we didn't use all tools of national power to crush this global terrorist network. So we blew an opportunity, and that's what really makes me upset, because people will die, and people have died because of the lack of engagement.
Yeah, that's a very important point you brought up there. The toolbox, the national security toolbox, people should use everything in it to stop terrorism, because Hezbollah is now a global threat to everyone. End of. They are now working very close with the Akani network and Al Qaeda.
So Anthony, I'll give you a quick story. I'd like to say, like, in America, like, if you're working a crime, a criminal case, and all of a sudden a potential terrorist event comes into your case, we do a really good job of coordinating that up to the terrorism investigators so they could do their thing, right? So a perfect example is the Iranian plot that was uncovered in 2012 in America, when the Quds forces had a plot to kill the Saudi Arabian ambassador in Washington, D.C., and also some other stuff in South America. But the DEA informant in Houston, Texas, was approached by a guy named Ababsio. He was basically trying to carry out an assassination, and he went to the DEA informant because he thought the informant was part of the Mexican cartels, right? So thank God he was an informant. The DEA went to the FBI, worked with the intelligence community, and they stopped this assassination from happening. And Ababsio and his accomplices were indicted. And then the world started saying, how the hell is Hezbollah going to carry out a terror act in America? How did this happen overnight? Well, it didn't happen overnight. It's been happening for years, and no one's paying attention to it. So we were lucky with that particular event, but we know from intelligence now that Iran and/or Hezbollah is reporting how they have operatives all over the world ready to go.
Yeah.
They're here. We don't know. I don't know anymore, but we know that they are set up. They're very sophisticated. They're in the Western Hemisphere, and they're ready to operate whenever they get the direction.
Okay. During your time with what was then Project Cassandra, were you ever able to apprehend any terrorist commanders, terrorist leaders? And what would, due to politics, have you ever had to let anyone go?
Yeah, well, I gave you an example. So General Carvajal was running all the command and control of the drugs. We arrested him in Aruba. He was let go and sent back to Venezuela. Walid Maqled, although I wouldn't consider these guys like global terrorists, they're drug traffickers, but they were helping the terrorists. Walid Maqled was arrested in Colombia. He was extradited back to Venezuela. He didn't come to America, all right? But the one that concerns me the most, only because this guy was a terrorist, Ali Fayed. Ali Fayed was set up by the DEA when I was still there in a sting operation and was arrested in the Czech Republic. And we did a sting just like we did against Victor Boot with the old drugs for weapons, right?
Yeah.
And Ali Fayed was this international like weapons guy for Hezbollah. And he basically was arrested and he was being, hopefully extradited back to America. But unfortunately, they came up with a kidnapping plot where they kidnapped five Czechs, and they wound up cutting a deal to release Ali Fayed out of prison in the Czech Republic, and he went back to Lebanon. The point of telling you that is the concern that we all had in America, in the DEA and our agencies here. Why didn't the U.S. government interject in those, opportunities, just like they did with Victor Boot? When we had Victor Boot in custody in Thailand, they ruled against extradition at the lower court. The vice president, the president, the attorney general at the time, Hillary Clinton, State Department, during the Obama days, they all stepped up big time, and we wound up getting Victor Boot extradited because the U.S. government's pretty powerful when they unite together, right?
Yeah.
But in these matters, nobody really stepped up and did anything, and these major targets were released. Well, then when the Politico magazine article came out, it was discussed how Obama administration was more concerned about doing the Iran deal, okay, than taking down Hezbollah. They didn't want to have any obstacles in the way of the Iran deal. So that's been like an ongoing debate in America. It's been highlighted on national news. It's been all over the world, like you said, reported. And I personally have my own opinion about it, but it was very bizarre, especially learning how sophisticated Hezbollah is and how dangerous they are in the world.
Yeah.
It was just surprising that we weren't more aggressive in the United States, and the politics once again took over.
Yeah, I think we both think the same about that. Anyway, our opinions are identical about that. But the law enforcement and the boys and girls out there, agents on the ground, doing some fantastic work as we speak anyway. Moving forward with Project Cassandra and other elements that are still ongoing, what is your opinion and how can they be more successful? Is this boiling down to government agencies and international agencies having better understanding and openness between each other?
Yeah, so it's a good question. I mean, first of all, even after all these obstacles, the DEA working with the task force at SOD, even after I retired, they continued. They had a very, very successful operation in Europe. In 2016, they arrested quite a few people, very significant Hezbollah operatives. They also did a lot of U.S. Treasury actions and sanctions. Abdullah Safi al-Din was later, highlighted in a big Treasury action. OFAC sanctions, designations were made. We arrested a bunch of people, extradited people. So it's ongoing. The problem is, and will always be, that we still haven't fixed the information sharing between the crime and terrorism cases. And that's a recipe for disaster, not just for the US, but for the world. Because to be honest with you, even in Europe, it's a lot worse over there. The laws are so antiquated. I mean, I had to go over to Germany and London just to talk to people and convince them to designate Hezbollah as a terrorist organization. They were like still playing the political game on the Hezbollah as a political organization, right?
Yeah.
So anyway, there's been some positive movement there as well, but the bad guys, they move full speed ahead. They don't have the bureaucracy. They don't have a resource issue, especially now that they're tapping into crime. But our systems, just to be very frank, they're broken. They're antiquated. Yeah. And the ego's getting away. The politics getting away. But here's the one thing I'll say. It doesn't mean that we don't have people working their butts off to keep America and other countries safe, because they work really hard.
Yeah.
And I'm proud of the work that they do. It just, there's an old saying, Anthony, you're supposed to work smarter, not harder.
Yeah, exactly. Just want my viewers to know that as well. Hezbollah, very nearly detonated 3-ton car bombs in London and 2 other cities across the UK. It was a tip-off by Israeli intelligence to British intelligence that the car bomb factory was actually found and the attacks were stopped as well. But even today, there's elements within the country that do not recognize Hezbollah as a terrorist organization. I hope this interview informs a lot of people out there about what Hezbollah actually are. Criminal organization and a terrorist organization combined. Derek, in your opinion, Project Cassandra moving forward, what is the biggest lesson from the past 20 years that you would bring up to present day?
Well, I would say that everybody in the world has to recognize how sophisticated, how advanced, how these terrorist crime groups are operating around the world. This is a global issue. It's not any one country. They're everywhere. And they have seamless communications on their encrypted apps that nobody really can infiltrate. And they are able to move very quickly. They have people positioned in all these countries because of the porous borders and all of these bogus asylum claims all over Europe and now in America in the southwest border. We have operatives ready to go. They're sitting here. So one of the lessons that has to be learned that hasn't been learned yet is that it's pretty much common sense. If the good guys are converging, if the bad guys are converging, the good guys must converge. Otherwise, we're never going to be able to deal with this. So we can control that, right, with leadership. Right now, the leadership has been lacking because we still have people worrying about their own little kingdoms as opposed to worrying about our countries. Yeah. And so that's kind of the greatest lesson. And that's kind of what I still try to fight from, my position now. But it's becoming more and more difficult because even President Obama identified Hezbollah as one of the most technically savvy terrorist organizations in the world. And that was going back like how many years now? Like that was like 2007.
Yeah.
And so they keep advancing and we still we're stuck in the mud, right? We're stuck in quicksand. We can't get out of our own way. And we have to have strong leaders, directing people to do things differently. You can't continue to do the same things over and over and expect a different result, right? Allegedly, Einstein said that's insanity, right?
Yeah.
So
yeah, it is. I think the terrorist organizations have evolved. 10 years ago, no one would have ever believed the Haqqani network, Al Qaeda, Taliban, Hezbollah all working together. Nobody would have ever written that. Now,
right.
It's fact. But the Western agencies, the governments, you can have the best people on the ground in the world, but you picked up a key point there. If the leadership is not right at the top, it won't filter down. So I think the leadership at the top, pulling all of the agencies together to an extent, would obviously help. With the other question I've got as well, because I've been speaking to some people about obviously the old topics and that from the Middle East, the designation of people trafficking, is that being classed as a terrorism or could be classed as an act of terrorism? Because terrorist organizations are using the migration problem to help them get their people across borders into other countries, into the United States, into Europe, into Great Britain. What's your thoughts on this?
That's a great question. So I've been pushing the designation of the Mexican cartels as a terrorist organization for about 3 to 4 years now. As a matter of fact, I testified in state court in Ohio regarding this matter. It received a lot of publicity when President Trump was in office. He was considering designating the cartels as terrorists. The problem was, and still is, the politicians and our State Department and other government agencies are worried more about their own little kingdoms, right? So they provided President Trump with bad information because they were under the impression that this designation would mean another war, right? No, it wouldn't mean that at all. It would just put the necessary focus and the resources on the problem. Right now, people aren't taking the cartels that serious because they're killing our citizens at record levels. We had like, we lose like 220 a day in America, 230 a day from the drug overdose. And most of it now is due to the Mexican cartels and the poisonous fentanyl and the counterfeit pills that are coming into America. So to me, it's a chemical war against our country. It's chemicals from China, it's fentanyl, it's chemicals made in labs in China, Wuhan, and other cities in China. So in my view, Anthony, China is using the Mexican cartels as proxies to destabilize the country by killing our younger and our future generation. Now, just like Iran uses Hezbollah as a proxy to help them carry out their overall agenda. China wants to destroy U.S. as an economic power. That's their goal, right? We're an adversary. So to me, again, I'm not an expert on communism. I'm not an expert on China, but it seems to me good old common sense. They're trying to destabilize our country, disguising it under this drug crisis. But going back to your point, I hope to see we have some movement, designating the cartels as terrorists, because that's what they are.
I think it's important. I think the cartels re-designated as terrorists, all of them, and the human trafficking.
Yeah, because they're all working together. I mean, the cartels are controlling all the movement of the migrants, and they're charging anywhere from, let's say, $3,000 to $10,000, $15,000, depending on what part of the world you're coming from.
Yeah.
And we call that special interest aliens here in America.
The other thing that my viewers might not be aware of as well is Al-Qaeda, through proxies in the narcotics, are using the narcotics and trying to flood the opium, the opioid, out of the Middle East, Afghanistan, into Europe, into the Americas.
Yeah.
I actually physically sat at a meeting with Salahuddin himself in Polish-Chaki, Afghanistan, and he is now the head of operations for the Taliban. He is now also the head of the Akani network, the head. Those words translated into English, what I've just told you, are from him. He wants to use the narcotics as a weapon against us in the West. A lot of viewers will not be aware of that.
No, exactly. I mean, when we arrested a couple of the kingpins, there was one, I believe it was Khan Muhammad. I can't remember if it was Haji Bachko or Khan Muhammad. He actually said selling heroin to the West is a jihad.
Yeah.
It's a 2-for-1 special. That's the way I look at it. They make millions, but they kill and they hurt and destabilize our country. So that's a planned action, Anthony.
Right. On this one, right, I'm going to start to wind down the interview in a few minutes. Is there anything else, Derek, that you would like to say?
No, I mean, I appreciate you, talking about these important topics. Obviously, my biggest concern is the information sharing between the criminal and the terrorist investigations. Yeah. And again, this is not just a U.S. issue. This is all over the place. Yeah. There's too many silos. 20 years after 9/11, we still have silos everywhere. And you would think, like, at least in America, they did the 9/11 Commission. That was one of the big points, like the lack of information sharing between the international terrorist cases and the U.S. crime cases, right? That was one of the findings. And so we haven't learned from our lessons, and that's really, really disturbing. So hopefully, as we continue, I mean, just as a quick example, we're coming up now on the Boston bombing 7th anniversary. Yeah. And the Tamerlan and his brother, they were involved with drugs. They were involved with drug trafficking. And we knew that after the fact, but nobody ever asked the Special Operations Division if we had any intel on them. So we didn't get a chance to provide, we had intel. We could have provided it to the Joint Terrorism Task Force, but they never asked us. Because in their minds, they were only looking at, was this guy involved with terrorism? Were they terrorists? And they couldn't find it. So the real lesson is every country needs to look at what we call the Al Capone model, right? Al Capone was a gangster, a mass murderer in America. The way he was taken off the battlefield was by an Internal Revenue Service tax violation. And he wound up doing significant time in jail, but we took him out of the position to commit additional murders, right? So if you have a potential terrorist and the terrorist might be involved in crime, you need to look at the background on the crime side. Maybe you could take the guy down on some crime and then they can't commit the terrorist act. That's the concept.
I think, well, it's a concept that is tried, proven, and works.
Right, exactly.
The terrorism, look at the money, follow the old rule, and that would work as well, because they can't be, as it stands now, the Hezbollah network, the amount of money that is getting pumped into international terrorism is phenomenal. But
Exactly.
okay, well, Derek, I'd like to say thank you so much for coming on again, speaking about Project Cassandra and the connections between organized crime, international terrorism as well. But from myself, my viewers in law enforcement and the intelligence community, I would just like to say thank you for your service as well.
Thank you, Anthony. Anytime, buddy.
Okay, mate. If you can hold on the line for a second, I'm going to close the interview down. Right, ladies and gentlemen, I hope that has been informative, and I hope you've learned something from the interview as well. That is the objective of the Patriot interviews. Thank you for your time, and I'll catch you on the next show. Goodbye and stay safe.